In 1720, a pirate named William Fly stood on the gallows in Boston Harbor. The crowd pressed in close, expecting him to beg, to weep, to confess every sin, and throw himself at the mercy of God and King. Instead, William Fly straightened his coat, looked the executioner dead in the eye, and lectured him on how to properly tie a noose. He wasn't being defiant for the sake of drama. He wasn't performing for the crowd. He was simply honoring a contract that had promised him a fair trial, a contract that had promised him medical care if he was wounded in battle, a contract that had promised him compensation if he lost a limb fighting for his crew. And now, at the very end of it all, that same contract required him to face death with the dignity of a free man. That contract was the pirate code. For 300 years, we have been told a very comfortable lie. We have been told that pirates were lawless savages, that they were monsters who lived in chaos, answered to no one, and terrorized the seas purely for blood and gold. Hollywood gave us Jack Sparrow, stumbling drunk across the deck, making up the rules as he went along. Treasure Island gave us Long John Silver, charming, treacherous, loyal to no one. But what if everything you think you know about pirates is wrong? What if the most dangerous men on the face of the earth, men the British Navy called the enemies of all mankind, were actually running the world's first functioning democracy? What if, while kings ruled by divine right and common sailors were flogged unconscious for the smallest infraction, the pirates of the Golden Age had already invented workplace safety laws, disability insurance, democratic elections, and a system of checks and balances that would take the so-called civilized world another 200 years to catch up to? Today, on the hidden democracy of the high seas, we pull back the curtain on the most extraordinary legal document ever written on a rolling deck. We are going to unmask the pirate code, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you will never see a black flag the same way again. But before we set sail, if you are the kind of person who hungers for the brutal, hidden truths that history books leave out, then hit that like button right now and subscribe to join the crew. Ring the bell icon so you never miss a single secret we uncover, because what we are about to reveal has been buried in colonial archives for 300 years, and almost nobody outside of a small group of historians even knows it exists. Alright, let's go back to the beginning. To understand why the pirate code was so revolutionary, you first have to understand what these men were running away from. Imagine you are a common sailor in England in the year 1710. You have two options. Option 1, you volunteer for a merchant ship. You will be paid almost nothing. You will eat rotting food. You will sleep in a hammock so close to the next man that you can hear him breathe. If you get sick, and you will get sick, because scurvy, dysentery, and typhoid are constant companions at sea, you will receive no medical care. If you are injured doing your job, you will be put ashore, unpaid, and left to beg on the streets of London. Option 2, you are press-ganged into the Royal Navy. Press-ganged means you did not volunteer. Press-ganged means a group of naval officers found you drinking in a tavern and physically dragged you aboard a ship. You have no say. You have no rights. Your captain has absolute, God-given authority over your life and death. He can flog you unconscious for looking at him the wrong way. He can starve you. He can work you to death. And when the war is over and they no longer need you, you are simply dropped ashore with nothing. This was the world that created pirates. Most of the men who turned to piracy were not born criminals. They were former naval sailors, former merchant seamen, men who had been cheated, beaten, starved, and discarded by the empires they had served. And when they took their first pirate ship and sat down to decide how things would be done differently, they wrote it all down. The document they created was called the Articles of Agreement. On some ships, it was called the Ship's Articles. On others, it was simply called the Code, and it was not a suggestion. It was not a polite set of guidelines. Every man who joined a pirate crew had to place his hand on it, on the Bible, or on a human skull, depending on the captain, and swear an oath. If you did not sign, You were not part of the crew, and if you broke the articles after signing, the punishment was swift and absolute. The first documented pirate code belonged to a Portuguese buccaneer named Bartholomew the Portuguese, operating off the coast of Brazil in 1663. His articles, discovered in the wreckage of his ship near Recife, outlined 23 rules governing everything from combat behavior to the precise division of treasure. The document itself, written in Portuguese with notes in Dutch and English, showed that pirates were already recruiting from multiple nations and needed a common legal framework that every man could understand, regardless of where he was born. But the most famous code, the one that became the template that other pirate crews copied, modified, and argued over in torchlit cabins across the Caribbean, that code belonged to a man named Bartholomew Roberts. And Roberts was unlike any pirate you have ever seen in a movie. Roberts, known to the world as Black Bart, captured over 400 ships between 1719 and 1722. He operated in the waters of West Africa, the Caribbean, and the Atlantic. He was meticulous, disciplined, and deeply religious. He did not drink alcohol. He held church services on Sundays, and he wrote one of the most sophisticated governance documents of the 18th century. His 11 articles became the foundation upon which an entire shadow civilization was built. Here is something that will genuinely shock you. On a pirate ship in 1720, the captain did not have absolute power. In fact, on most pirate ships, the captain was barely in charge at all, except in one very specific situation. Article 1 of Bartholomew Roberts' code reads, "Every man has a vote in affairs of the moment. Every man has an equal title to the fresh provisions or strong liquors at any time seized, and may use them at pleasure, unless scarcity makes it necessary, for the good of all, to vote a retrenchment." Ride that again. Every man has a vote in affairs of the moment. Not every officer, not every senior sailor, every man. The cook who made the biscuits, the youngest boy who climbed the rigging, the newest recruit who had been on board for 3 days. Every single person on that ship had an equal democratic voice in how it was run. When a merchant ship appeared on the horizon, the crew voted on whether to attack. When they captured a prize, they voted on how to divide it. When they needed to decide which port to sail to, they voted. When they needed a new captain, they elected one. And if the captain they elected proved incompetent, or worse, if he proved tyrannical, they voted him out. Sometimes they voted to maroon him on a deserted island. Sometimes they simply transferred him to a different ship. But the point is, the captain served at the pleasure of the crew, not the other way around. Think about what that means. In the British Royal Navy in 1720, a captain could have a man flogged to death for desertion, insubordination, or simply for annoying him on a bad morning. There was no appeal, there was no trial, there was no vote. The captain's word was the law of God and king combined. On a pirate ship, if a captain tried that, if he punished a man without the crew's consent, he could be voted out before sunset. But democracy needs more than just votes. It needs structure, and the pirates understood this. That is why every pirate ship had a quartermaster, and the quartermaster's job was unlike anything that existed in the legitimate world of sailing. The quartermaster was elected by the crew, and he served as their permanent representative, their shield against the captain's authority. He settled disputes between crewmen. He oversaw the distribution of food and water to ensure no one was cheated. He led boarding parties when a prize was taken. And most critically, he could veto the captain's decisions in non-combat situations. If the captain wanted to torture a prisoner and the quartermaster said no, the torture did not happen. If the captain wanted to change course and the quartermaster believed it was against the crew's interests, the matter went to a vote. The captain was the sword, the quartermaster was the conscience. Together, they created a system of checks and balances on a rolling wooden ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, a system that the United States Constitution would not formalize for another 60 years. Captain Edward England England learned this lesson the hard way in 1720. England was sailing the Indian Ocean when his crew captured a merchant captain named James Macrae. England, moved by Macrae's bravery during the battle, decided to spare him and release him with a ship, a decision he made entirely on his own, without consulting his crew. The crew was furious. The articles were clear. Major decisions required a vote. England had acted like a tyrant. His crew held a formal vote, found him guilty of violating the code, and marooned him on the island of Mauritius with a pistol and a bottle of rum. The man who had commanded hundreds of pirates was left alone on a beach because he forgot to ask permission. Now we arrive at perhaps the most astonishing part of the pirate code, something so advanced, so genuinely progressive that it would not be replicated by any national government on Earth for another century and a half. Article 8 of Bartholomew Roberts' code states, "If any man shall lose a limb or become a cripple in the service of the company, he shall have 800 pieces of 8 from the common stock, and for lesser hurts, proportionally 800 pieces of 8. That was roughly 2 years' wages on a legitimate merchant ship in one payment, guaranteed, from a fund that the crew maintained specifically for this purpose. But it went further than that. The pirates had developed a detailed injury compensation scale, a tariff of the body, if you will, that covered virtually every type of wound a man might sustain in battle or while working the ship. The loss of both eyes, 1,000 pieces of 8. The loss of one eye, 100 pieces of 8. The loss of a hand, 600 pieces of 8. The loss of a finger, 100 pieces of 8. A severe gunshot wound that left a man unable to work, 400 pieces of 8. The crew maintained a detailed injury log, recording every wound sustained in every battle. When they divided a prize, the injury compensation fund was filled first, before a single common crewman received his share. The wounded were protected even if the next prize proved small or non-existent. Now consider what happened to a British Royal Navy sailor who lost his leg in battle in 1720. He was discharged without ceremony, without pension, without compensation of any kind. He was given his final wages, usually several months in arrears, often paid in worthless promissory notes, and put ashore. He would spend the rest of his life begging on the streets of Portsmouth or Bristol, showing his stump to passers-by and hoping for a coin. Meanwhile, a pirate who lost his leg in that same era received the equivalent of 2 years' wages in a single payment, enough to retire comfortably, enough to buy a small house, enough to open a business. Former pirates with serious injuries settled in Port Royal, Jamaica, or Nassau, running taverns and boarding houses funded entirely by their compensation payments. This was not charity. This was not mercy. This was a calculated system designed to solve a very practical problem. If injured men received nothing, the healthy men had every incentive to abandon them in battle or throw them overboard when they became a burden. The compensation system changed that calculus completely. It gave every man on the ship a reason to fight for his crewmates, because he knew that if the situation were reversed, they would fight for him. The British Parliament would not establish any form of naval disability pension until 1853. The United States did not create a comprehensive workers' compensation system until the early 20th century. The pirates of the Golden Age had figured it out in 1690. We have talked about the big ideas: democracy, compensation, checks on power, but some of the most fascinating parts of the pirate code are the specific, granular rules that governed everyday life on these ships. Rules that seem strange at first glance, until you understand the exact problem each one was designed to solve. Roberts's third article was simple. No person was to game at cards or dice for money. This was not about morality. This was not because pirates had any objection to fun. It was because gambling creates winners and losers. Gambling creates debt. Gambling creates the kind of burning resentment that festers for weeks and then erupts in a knife fight at 3 in the morning. When you are trying to outrun a Royal Navy frigate, a crew that is fighting over cards cannot function. The rule was simple pragmatism, and it was strictly enforced. Article 11 of Roberts' Code states that the lights and candles were to be put out at 8 o'clock at night. If any crew desired to drink after that hour, they were to sit upon the open deck without lights. This one seems almost comical until you remember that these ships were made entirely of wood, packed with gunpowder, and sailing through conditions where a single candle knocked over during a fight could kill every man aboard. Roberts was not trying to enforce a bedtime. He was trying to prevent the entire ship from being accidentally incinerated by a drunk man who fell asleep with a candle. Captain George Lowther, who sailed the Caribbean in 1721, took this even further. His code specified that if any man smoked tobacco in the hold without a cap to his pipe, or carried a candle lit without a lantern, he would suffer the same punishment as if he had deserted, which meant marooning or death. Lowther had survived a ship fire. He was not taking any chances. Article 4 of Roberts' Code required that every man keep his pistol, cutlass, and musket clean and ready for action at all times. Inspections were held regularly. Any man found with a rusted weapon or a dull blade faced a reduction in his share of the next prize. Again, not morality, pure practicality. A pistol that misfires in the middle of a boarding action is not just useless, it is a death sentence for the man holding it and everyone around him. And then there is Article 7, possibly the most human, most unexpectedly touching rule in the entire code. The musicians were to have rest on the Sabbath day by right, on all other days by favor only. Yes, pirate ships had official musicians, fiddlers, drummers, horn players, men whose entire job was to keep morale high during the crushing boredom of long ocean crossings, to play during battles to steady the crew's nerves, and to provide entertainment in port. And the Pirate Code, a document written by violent men who terrorized the Caribbean, guaranteed those musicians one guaranteed day off per week by right, not as a privilege that could be taken away. By right, in the British Royal Navy, a musician had no such protection. A naval captain could order the musicians to play until they collapsed. There was no day off. There was no guaranteed rest. There was no right. There was only the captain's whim. On a pirate ship, even the fiddler had rights that the Royal Navy did not recognize. Article 9 addressed one of the most common sources of violence on any ship: personal disputes. The rule was elegant in its simplicity. No man was to strike another on board the ship. Every man's quarrel was to be ended on shore by sword or pistol in a formal duel. Until then, the two men were to work together professionally without letting their personal conflict affect the ship. This prevented blood feuds from destroying crew cohesion. It kept violence controlled and formal rather than spontaneous and chaotic, and it meant that two men who genuinely hated each other could still function as part of a crew, knowing that their dispute had a formal resolution waiting for them at the next port. It was a system for managing the inevitable conflicts that arise when 100 violent, desperate men are confined to a small wooden ship for months at a time. And it worked. Before we reach our conclusion, there is one more element of the Pirate Code that deserves your full attention, because it gets to the heart of why men left respectable careers to sail under the black flag in the first place. The division of plunder on a pirate ship was not left to the captain's discretion. It was written into the articles clearly and specifically so that every man knew exactly what he had earned before he ever set foot on the ship. Roberts' Code was explicit. The captain and the quartermaster each received 2 shares of any prize. The master gunner and the boatswain received 1.5 shares. Senior officers received 1.25 shares. Common crewmen received 1 full share each, and every man could do the math himself. When Roberts' crew captured a Spanish treasure galleon off the coast of Hispaniola in 1720, the total prize was valued at 30,000 pieces of 8. Using the share system, each common crewman received exactly 200 pieces of 8. The captain received 400. Every man could verify the division. There was no room for the captain to skim off the top, hide valuables for himself, or favor certain crewmen over others. The transparency was absolute. Compare this to life on a legitimate merchant ship. The captain received a massive salary. Senior officers received comfortable wages. Common sailors, the men who actually did the climbing and hauling and fighting, received poverty wages that were often paid months late, in currency that merchants would not accept, or in company credit that could only be spent at company stores. The system was designed to keep common sailors permanently poor and permanently dependent. Compare it to the Royal Navy during wartime. When a naval ship captured an enemy vessel, the prize money went mostly to the officers. The captain might receive £5,000. The 300 sailors who risked their lives in the actual battle might split £200 among them, 7 shillings each, for a battle that could have killed every one of them. On a pirate ship, the man who climbed the rigging, and the man who loaded the cannon, and the man who led the boarding party all received the same share as each other. And that share was real money, significant money, money that could change a man's life. This was not idealism. This was the most powerful recruitment tool in the history of maritime crime. Word spread through every port town in the Caribbean. Pirate ships pay fairly. Pirate ships treat you like a human being. Pirate ships give you a vote. Skilled sailors, men with options, men who could have found legitimate work, chose piracy specifically because the terms were better. The code was not just words written on parchment. It was enforced consistently, formally, and sometimes with a degree of mercy that would surprise you. Consider the case of Thomas Annis, serving under Captain George Lowther in 1721. Annis was caught stealing from the common chest. The theft was small, a handful of coins, but under the articles, theft from the common stock was a serious offense. The crew convened a formal trial. Annis was allowed to speak in his own defense. He had a sick mother in London, he said. She needed money for medicine. He had planned to send his share of the next prize to her, but the next prize had not come, and he feared she would die before he could help her. He had taken only enough for 1 letter and a small amount of medicine. He had planned to replace it from his own share when the time came. The crew debated for hours. Some argued for strict enforcement. The code must mean something, and mercy for one man set a precedent that would invite every desperate sailor to help himself. Others argued for the circumstances. Finally, they voted guilty, but with a reduced sentence. Annis would receive 30 lashes and forfeit his share of the next 2 prizes. The money he had taken would be returned to the common stock, and in a decision that still astonishes historians, an equivalent amount would be sent to his mother from the ship's general funds. It was not mercy, it was justice tempered by circumstance, exactly what the code demanded. A crew of violent outlaws had just conducted a more nuanced trial than most common men in England would ever receive from an actual court of law. By 1730, the golden age of piracy was over. The British Navy had increased its Atlantic patrols dramatically. Merchant ships began traveling in armed convoys. Colonial governors, under pressure from London, offered pardons to pirates who surrendered, and many took them. Exhausted by years of running, one by one, the great pirate captains fell. Blackbeard was killed in battle off the coast of North Carolina in 1718. Bartholomew Roberts died fighting a British warship off the coast of West Africa in 1722. His crew, in a detail that speaks volumes about the loyalty the code created, fought on for hours after their captain had fallen. They could have surrendered. They could have claimed they were forced into piracy. They chose to honor their captain's memory by following the code to the very end. The last documented pirate code was written by a Captain Johnson operating off the coast of Madagascar in 1729. It contained 16 articles, most borrowed directly from Roberts, but with one extraordinary addition. Article 16 stated that when the crew voted to dissolve and end their piracy, all articles would be burned, and no man would speak of them again. Johnson's crew voted to dissolve in 1731. They took the king's pardon, scattered across 3 continents, and as far as historians can tell, they kept their word. The code was burned. No man spoke of it, but ideas do not burn as easily as paper. The former pirates who disappeared into colonial port towns and taverns carried something invisible with them, the memory of a system where the lowest man had the same vote as the captain, where rules applied equally to everyone, where you could rise or fall based on competence rather than birth, where a man's body had value and its loss was compensated. These were not pirate ideas. These were human ideas that the pirates had simply dared to put into practice while the rest of the world was still bowing to kings. 50 years after the golden age of piracy ended, those same ideas appeared in documents with names like the Declaration of Independence and the Rights of Man. The men who wrote those documents were not pirates, but they were asking the same question the pirates had asked a half-century before. Why should power rest with kings and captains? Why cannot ordinary people govern themselves? So, were the pirates of the Golden Age simply murderers and thieves? Yes, they were. Let us not romanticize that. They attacked ships. They killed people. They were violent, desperate men operating outside the law by choice. But they were also something else. Something that their era, and perhaps our own, did not fully know how to categorize. They were men who had been failed by every system that was supposed to protect them. Men who had been beaten, cheated, starved, and discarded by the empires they had served. And when they found themselves with the freedom to build something different, they built the most fair and sophisticated system they knew how to build. They built a democracy before most nations had one. They built a disability compensation system before any government thought to. They created checks on executive power when the most powerful king on earth still ruled by divine right. They enforced transparency in the division of wealth when every legitimate institution in the world was designed to keep wealth hidden from those who created it. The pirate code was real. It was strange. It was enforced by violent men in extraordinary circumstances, but it worked, and it proved something that the empires hunting these men did not want to admit, that ordinary people, given the right system and the right incentives, are perfectly capable of governing themselves fairly when justice disappears, when the institutions meant to protect people instead crush them. People build their own justice. They always have. And sometimes, against all odds, they build it remarkably well. The question I want to leave you with today is not really about pirates. It is about us. If a group of outlaws on a wooden ship in 1710 could figure out disability insurance, democratic elections, transparent finances, and limits on executive power, what is stopping the modern world from demanding the same?